Hello again, internets. This is my second video about wood-burning camp stoves. In the first video, I introduced this MSP Core stove, which I backed on Kickstarter and received a few days ago. And then in part 2, I'm going to compare this stove to some other wood-burning stoves in my collection. I'm Charlie Hudson, and you are watching Reanderthal. I'm a Kickstarter junkie, and I'm a camp stove junkie, and I like wood-burning stoves in particular. And the reason for that is that I'm human, and I like playing with fire. And a wood-burning camp stove allows you to kindle just a small little fire and get some actual usable cooking power out of it. And so today, as I said, we're going to compare the Core stove to some of my other stoves. First off, we have the MSP Core stove. It packs flat, so that's nice. It's made of titanium, so it's lightweight. And it also, if you add the all of the different features, it should be a wood gasifying stove, meaning that it reburns some of the smoke. The next stove I've got is a homemade stove. It's made out of 3 cans. We've got a quart paint can, got a Progresso soup can, and a canned chicken can. This is another wood gasifying stove. This actually may be lighter, although you could, of course, take off some of these parts. Another stove that I really like is the M kettle, and this is a chimney kettle. It is not a gasifying stove, meaning that it just, there's plenty of smoke that comes up through. But the water, this is only for heating water, and the water is inside of this conical container that the flame and smoke come up through. And so basically all of the soot, rather than being on the outside of your pot and having to scrub it and it gets all over everything that it comes in contact with, it's nice and contained within the chimney. There is another chimney kettle out there. There are a number of chimney kettles out there. Another notable one, I believe, is called the Backcountry Boiler, which was on Kickstarter, and it's where I actually heard about the M kettle, what put me on to the M kettle. The reason I decided to go with the M kettle, even though it is a little bit heavier, is that it's anodized, and whereas the Backcountry Boiler is just raw aluminum, and I just felt more comfortable drinking water that had been heated in an anodized container rather than just straight up aluminum. The last wood-burning stove I'll show is this Sierra stove, which I bought way back in 1999 or 2000. Now, I'm very close to getting rid of this stove. It's just quite heavy, especially with the battery. So the deal with this stove is there's a battery-powered fan, and it actually forces air. The air comes in through the bottom, forced by the fan, goes up inside the inner container, and then is blown into the bottom. It's preheated and then blown into the bottom of the fire. And because of that, you can burn really, some really wet, junky fuel. So that's nice, but it is just quite heavy, and it burns. This pot actually looks pretty clean right now, but it just is really, really sooty. If you were looking for a stove that force-fed air into the fire, these days there's at least one and maybe more than one option that actually use this sort of device which transfers heat into electricity to power a fan, so you don't have to worry about batteries. I believe the most popular one is called the BioLite stove. And so you could look into that. Personally, as a former thru hiker, I get a little obsessive sometimes about weight, and I just wouldn't want to hike with something this heavy. And I think the BioLite stove is pretty heavy as well. So lastly, honorable mention goes to the old Coke can alcohol stoves. This is obviously not a wood-burning stove, but I'll just compare this guy as well if I have any methanol lying around. Like this guy, it's easy to put together yourself, cheap to put together. It doesn't take much to burn alcohol, so the stoves can be quite lightweight. Alcohol itself as a fuel is pretty heavy per BTU, so for a longer trip you probably want to look at some other sort of fuel or a wood-burning stove. So there are our stoves, and let's get out and boil some water. Well, this much maligned Sierra stove did probably the best of anybody so far.
Really?
Yeah.
How about that fancy new one?
It's burning away, that's for sure. And it's pretty easy to feed.
That's nice.
Okay, so there were a few problems with the first round of tests. Most notably, the camera cut out a few times, and so there was no official boil time on a number of the tests. So we're going to redo the top 3 competitors right now and see who takes the cake. So remember to remove that cork before you start. One thing that I would add about the M kettle and other chimney kettles is that setup and cleanup are very simple. So although the burn time may take a little bit longer, I'm sure that you could reduce that burn time with practice, but it does seem to take a little bit longer. But if you take into account the setup time and especially the cleanup time, this may change your calculus a bit. Especially if you are looking to use this while traveling and you want to pull something out in the middle of the day. You might think twice about unpacking and setting up the core stove and then waiting until it cools and cleaning everything off and putting it back in your bag. You pull this out, you've got a container of water, you've got your pot, and there's enough room in this bag to have some tinder and fire starters of whatever sort. That's another benefit with the alcohol stoves as well. They're dead simple to use. You just put a little alcohol in, you light it, you let it prime itself, and that's it. And afterwards, alcohol burns so cleanly that there's very little cleanup you have to worry about. And so the boil time may not be as quick, but if you take into account the entire cooking and cleaning process, now this little alcohol stove is starting to look a little bit better. But of course, you are tied down to getting a regular supply of alcohol. Okay, so one thing I haven't done yet is to see how much each of the stoves weigh. Some of the systems, for instance the Zip stove, have their own pots, and some don't. So for those that don't, I'm going to include this little lightweight titanium pot. I think that's more than fair. The M kettle does not require an extra pot for cooking, but you will need something to put that heated water into. So I'm going to include the titanium pot and its bag. I would say that there is a place for all of these stoves. Each of them had their strengths and weaknesses. Airflow was a problem with both my homemade stove and also, to a lesser degree, the M kettle. The Sierra stove, my memory of using the Sierra stove was from the one time we fired it up on the first night of our through hike, and I was not remembering it very fondly. Well, it turns out, batteries running out aside, it did burn very reliably. It didn't take a whole lot of babysitting. So there is that. You get a pretty reliable burn. That said, it is heavy, and it of course does require batteries. I think this is best suited for car camping. Maybe you pull into a campsite late at night. You can't really search for good wood, so you're going to be burning some junky stuff, and you have a pack of charged batteries in the car. That's probably the situation you're going to be using this. And you're going to have to deal with some soot. The M kettle. I had a little bit of trouble getting a really strong burn through this stove. I was not as careful about airflow as I should have been. But nevertheless, it burned water pretty quickly. And the reason is there's two sides to the water boiling equation. You can burn your wood more efficiently, or you can capture the heat more efficiently, and that's what a chimney kettle does. The other nice thing about this stove is it's rock solid. There's very little about this that is likely to break. So I think this is well suited for a situation where you're going to be in the backcountry for a while. And the other nice thing is this guy serves a number of jobs. You can carry water in it, you can boil water in it, and it's its own self-contained stove system. So this is a good option if you're going to be in the backcountry for a long time. Okay, this brings me to the homemade gasifier stove. This one worked okay, especially in the beginning, but as the burn time went on, the air intake would get clogged up. And so I went back later, I took it apart, and I drilled some new holes. Well, part of the problem is, as soon as I broke the seal between these two stoves, it really hasn't held together very well afterwards. So that's of course an issue with the jury-rigged stove. Now, there is still a place for this stove, but right now I would say that place is more for tinkerers than people who want to get a reliable burn. Next we'll talk about the alcohol stove. The alcohol stove weighs in at a scant 0.029 pounds, but of course, using an alcohol stove, you also have to bring fuel. And with everything, we are now in, and of course that's a randomly chosen amount of fuel, but now we're weighing in at 0.672. Still the lightest stove, but with this other DIY stove, a close runner-up. As I was packing everything up, I noticed that the amount of alcohol I weighed the alcohol stove with would really only last a day or two. So I'm going to dub the alcohol stove the lightest only for very short trips, and the DIY stove the lightest for anything longer than 2 days. I think an alcohol stove like this is best suited for a short trip when it wouldn't be the biggest disaster if your fuel got knocked over or something and you ended up without fuel. This served me really well for 700 miles of the AT on 4 to 5 day resupply periods. And you know, I'll probably use it again on hiking trips. And then finally we have the Core stove. This was a very good all-around stove. It got a very reliable, pretty clean burn. I think if I was a little bit more careful, I could have cut down on the smoke even further. Some of the other stoves had an issue with airflow, but as you can see, there's ample air intake here. That wasn't an issue. The burn was pretty clean, and it didn't take a lot of babysitting. And also, the bottom feed is very nice. You don't have to get really small pieces and try to stick them in around your pot. You can just take a long stick and just feed it in as it burns. So that makes it simple. So this is a good all-around choice. And because it's very lightweight and it packs flat, this is a good option if either space or weight are at a premium, and something you can have basically in your back pocket if you need it. So there you have it. I think the Core stove acquitted itself very well, but there are situations where you might choose some of these other stoves. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.